Good morning, everyone. This is Father Nate, missionary priest in Italy, and thanks for joining us today, December 2nd, on No Greater Delight, our podcast on Marian feasts and Marian meditations. Well, today we have quite a number of feasts, so without further ado, we'll get started in Cappadocia with Our Lady of Didinia. So the Abbot Orsini writes that Our Lady of Didinia is in Cappadocia. It was before this shrine that St. Basil had begged the Blessed Virgin to remedy the disorders caused by Julian the Apostate. The saint was granted a vision from Mary, which foretold the death of the emperor. Okay, so that's Orsini's very summary. If we recall, the Emperor Julian the Apostate was quite the persecutor of Christians, and he had threatened the city of Caesarea with destruction because he bore some grudge towards it. So St. Basil gathered the frightened inhabitants on Mount Didinia, where there's an ancient church dedicated to Our Lady. So after 3 days of prayer and fasting, the tradition goes, Basil had a vision in which he saw Mary surrounded by a celestial army and heard her say, "Go call Mercury to me. He shall kill the blasphemer of my son." So it was this Mercury, or Saint Mercurius, right? He was a saint martyr who died in the year 250, right? Very strong man, very courageous, and he was a soldier, and after winning a victory in combat, he refused to burn incense to the false idols, and so he was tortured and then killed for his faith in God, right? So after that vision of the Mother and God, both St. Basil and Libanius went to the Church of St. Mercury, right? The thing is, in this Church of St. Mercury, were the weapons of St. Mercurius, right? They were usually hung on there for display and veneration. But when Basil gets to the church, the weapons are missing. And so they say, ooh, okay, interesting. So obviously he thinks of what Our Lady said, and so he goes back to Mount Didinia, rejoicing, and he tells the people that Julian the Apostate has been killed. So when the faithful come back to the city, and they enter the Church of St. Mercurius, they find that the lance of Mercury was back where it had usually been, although it was now wet with blood. So the Emperor Julian the Apostate had gone on campaign in Persia, but he had to retreat. It was later found out that he had died in that foreign land, the same night that St. Mercurius's weapons had mysteriously gone missing. History records that he received a wound from a spear that pierced his liver and intestines, which produced a major hemorrhage, and that's what killed him. So there you are, St. Mercurius, doing his job even after his death on earth. Well, then we jump up to France for Our Lady of Lisieux in Picardy, right? It's probably around the 12th century. It can't go any further back than that, right? The statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which adorns this place, is quite precious, quite marvelous, right? There's a very long tradition about how this statue got there. Okay, so what happened? Well, during this time, some of the French were served as knights in the Holy Land, right? And so what happened? Well, at some point, some of these knights of St. John were ambushed. They were taken in chains by the Muslims into Egypt. So these three particular knights were men of noble standing. So they were looked impressive. They walked with their heads held high. All these great things. When the Sultan sees them, he really wants to win them over to his faith, and so he throws them in the dungeon, thinking that that's gonna make them weak. But no, they didn't care. Okay, so then he sends his most celebrated imams to argue with them. And then all of a sudden, these good knights become excellent theologians and defend Christianity. So then the Sultan is like, okay, well, what can I do now? And so he decided to send his daughter in, right? Not to seduce them, but to talk to them. She was very beautiful, chaste, very intelligent. And she sent them to convince the knights to change, right? To explain to them what awaited them if they didn't convert. So the knights were very respectful. They talked to her, they explained and defended their faith, so much so that the princess really thought about, what they had said. So it's said that the miraculous image of Our Lady of Lisieux was brought by the angels to those knights, right? And then it was that, miraculous image that appeared that really convinced the princess to convert. So one night, after she had bribed the guards, she entered into their prison with lots of precious jewels in order to, pay for their escape. And yes, so they escaped. So the 3 knights along with the princess, right? So everything worked out. They were headed out to the desert to, sneak away. And at some point, the princess was very tired. She said, please, just let me sleep. So they said, okay. And these are very good stories. It says they made her sit down in a field and seated themselves at a respectful distance so she could fall asleep away from the knights, and the knights just kept guard. But unfortunately, the knights were tired too, so they also fell asleep. Nobody knows for how long, but what happened? Well, then they wake up, and one of the knights, when he wakes up, he looks and he says, hey, this is not next to the Nile where we fell asleep. He's like, this looks almost exactly like my home in France. And so, as he sees a shepherd passing by, he says, well, where am I? And he said, no, this is France, right at your own castle, right? And so, he gave thanks to the Blessed Virgin Mary and woke up his fellow knights, who were surprised, his fellow knights and the princess. And so, they built a handsome church, a beautiful church, where they would house the image of Our Lady of Lisieux, and the princess received baptism in the Cathedral of Leon, right? Now, people say that, well, that sounds a little bit exaggerated, but we know for a fact that it was brought from the Holy Land by these 3 men, right? The last feast of today is La Virgen de Belén, Our Lady of Belén, in Belén, Salta, Argentina, right? A sculptor named Idelberg Ferrino got the idea for a statue when he was in the town of Belén. He got stuck there just providentially on vacation. He became friends with some of the officials, and along with the priests, they came up with this idea to build a giant image of the town's patroness, the Virgen de Belén, Our Lady Belén. And this huge image was finally installed on the summit of El Tiro, which is a mountain overlooking the city of Belén, on December 2nd, 1982, right? And so the white cement Virgin blesses the valley, holds the child in her left arm, and a loaf of bread in her right. For today's reading from True Devotion to Mary by Saint Louis de Montfort, we continue with part 2 on the most excellent devotion to Our Lady, or the perfect consecration to Jesus through Mary. And now we start section 4, particular practices of this devotion. And then there is part or subsection 1, which concerns the external practices. So again, we're going to talk about what do we do in order to really consecrate ourselves to Mary. And, it'll be important because he'll talk to us about a number of different things. In fact, here he has 7 different practices, and then he's going to add some more internal practices, but that's the next section. So let's start today with external practices. And so in 226, he gives us sort of a general overview. He says, although what is essential in this devotion consists in the interior, we must not fail to unite to the inward practice certain external observances, ec oportet facere, et no illa non omettere. We must do the one, yet not leave the other undone. Both because the outward practices, well performed, aid the inward ones, and because they make a man remember, by reminding his senses, what he has done or ought to do. And also because they are suitable to edify our neighbor who sees them, which inward practices cannot do. Let no worldly, then, or critic sneer at this. Let them not say that because true devotion is in the heart, we must avoid external devotion, or that devotion ought to be hidden, or that there may be vanity in showing it. I answer with my master that men should see our good works, that they may glorify our Father who is in heaven. Not, as St. Gregory says, that we ought to perform our actions and exterior devotions to please men and to get praise, that would be vanity, but that we should sometimes do them before men, with the view of pleasing God and glorifying him thereby, without caring either for the contempt or the praise of men. I will only allude briefly to some exterior practices, which I do not call exterior because we do them without any interior, but because they have something outward about them, to distinguish them from those that are purely inward. So again, this is a good point that Louis de Montfort is making. He says, okay, these are external things that are visible on the outside. He says because people can't see our inward devotion. And we don't do these things to get praised or to be mocked by people. We just do it in other, he says, quoting Jesus, that people may see our external actions and glorify God the Father. So with this first practice then, we turn to point 227, and he says, those who wish to enter into this particular devotion, which is not at present erected into any confraternity, though that were to be wished, after having, as I said in the first part of this preparation for the reign of Jesus Christ, employed 12 days at least in emptying themselves of the spirit of the world, which is contrary to the spirit of Jesus Christ, should employ 3 weeks in filling themselves with Jesus Christ by the Holy Virgin. They should pursue the following order. And so then tomorrow we'll continue with this. What is the order of this preparation? So he says, okay, we spent 12 days trying to empty ourselves of the spirit of the world, and then it's going to be another 3 weeks trying to fill ourselves with Jesus Christ by means of Mary. And so it works out to be more or less a month of preparation.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our Marian podcast. As St. John Paul II teaches us, from Mary we learn to love Christ, her Son, the Son of God. Through her intercession, may we grow ever closer to Him. We encourage you to share this with a loved one or friend and help spread our devotion to Mary. Thank you, and God bless.